Hello guys, Ren here, welcome to my room. Happy Sunday. I hope you are doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of the grip, using and illustrating from the SE grip in the case of INFJs and INTJs, because I think it's a concept that is given insufficient justice online in our community. Before I move on, just remember that I have written 2 books in the last year: The Ecstatic Soul, reference book on the INFJ type, and The Infinite Castle, my new novel that I think can be appreciated particularly by INFJs and hopefully across the board. Both less than $10, all the links available below. Appreciate your support. Don't forget, by my Patreon, there's a link there to support me as well. That is much, much appreciated. So the concept of grip. I think a lot of us have a vague idea, at least, of what being in the grip is, especially maybe more so the grip of SE in the case of us INFJs and the INTJs in the audience as well. I wanted to discuss this concept a bit further today because it seems to me, so number one is something that I mentioned earlier. The concept is employed because it serves a particular function, a particular descriptive function, when we describe our experiences, certainly. But the descriptions are relatively superficial, I think, and they go more or less like, okay, I'm going through a stressed phase and I can sense that I'm in the grip of SE, and therefore I'm kind of living in the moment and I don't have a lot of control over what I'm doing and I'm kind of acting impulsively. Now, all of this is true, but it doesn't go very deep, if you like, and I'd like to go a bit deep, but also by way of emphasizing that in this day and age where personality theories are so popular, that we have a proliferation of different models, some very interesting, some perhaps a bit more, a bit less interesting, or you could argue that. Obviously, the traditional MBTI model, which has been historically attacked many times and still is, actually has a strength that a lot of other models don't have. And so I wanted to talk about this because often when we are speaking from the point of view of MBTI and the Jungian cognitive functions sort of paradigm, when we are speaking about it in a meta kind of way, we are defensive instead of offensive, instead of positive. We're trying to defend the model against people who accuse it of various things, truly or falsely. But we're rarely these days in a position where we promote what are the good things about it that perhaps other models don't have. And in fact, some of the weaknesses of MBTI are also contained within themselves some of its strengths, like two sides of the same coin. In a very brief summary, what I would say is precisely because MBTI is not in its current state a scientific model, it can provide a level of descriptive depth that the models that aim to be more scientific don't have. And they cannot claim to have them, they cannot ever hope to have them, because the descriptions in question are not scientifically replicable. They differ too much from one experience to another. And in some sense, they might not be testable, and insofar as they are not testable, they cannot be falsified by testing. So that's no good for a scientific model, but for a model that does not try to be scientific in the first instance, but who focuses to begin with and, largely on sharing private experiences that turn out to have such commonalities that speaking of type communities is meaningful from the point of view of those communities. Well, in these cases, the descriptions can go very deep. And then people can decide at what level of depth they're willing to go and still relate. Now, let's take all of what we've said here and apply it to the concept of the grip. The concept of the grip requires that we accept not just that there are 4 functions, okay? At least 4 functions in the main stack. I think the concept of the grip is to some extent agnostic as to, sorry, just making sure that my cat is fine. Yeah, my cat is here, you can see her, and that's Cookie, you know, so I still miss Hazelnut, as you can imagine, but Cookie is a wonderful cat. There's also Bash downstairs, another one. Now, I think that the concept of the grip is agnostic as regards whether we want to think that there are really 8 functions, 4 of which are shadow functions. It's probably possible to hold the concept of the grip even if one believes that there are shadow functions. Although I would say, I'm tempted to think that if that were the case, there'd be a bit of tension. Because, you know, by definition, if one subscribes to an 8-function model, so in the case of the INFJ, the 8th function would be SI. Now, according to that shadow model, SI would be the least conscious function for the INFJ. Therefore, why would not the INFJ be in the SI grip? Why does the grip attach to the 4th function and not the 8th? And that's unexplained, and again, part of the reason why I much prefer sticking to a 4-function model. So sticking to the 4-function model is the better alternative when we talk about the grip. And further, again, something that MBTI very clearly preserves from the Jungian tradition is the idea that the functions are quite clearly in that 4-function stack. They're quite clearly differentiated in terms of level of consciousness. So the dominant function is always conscious or largely conscious, and then we have the descending order from then onwards. What's important to keep in mind is that for the INFJ, as for any other type, but let's say the INFJ in this case and SE for the INFJ can never be completely integrated in MBTI. This is something that these days, a lot of the good, interesting models that are alternatives to MBTI reject. They reject that SE has to remain largely unintegrated. Like it's in some sense, SE for INFJs and INTJs is a function that we have to cope with. You know, it's always something that we have to cope with rather than something that we control. And it's true, certainly true, that with age, experience, life circumstances, one can learn to cope with SE way better than maybe previously or compared to other people. But it's never going to be fully integrated. And that comes from Jung, you know, comes from Jung, and it's very, very closely linked and dependent on the fundamental assumptions that Jung has in psychological types, his book Psychological Types. Because if, you know, just note this, for Jung, there's obviously a very close connection between the cognitive functions and the unconscious-conscious distinction. If you allow for the possibility that all functions of an individual are integrated and largely conscious, almost like having 4 dominant functions, well, first of all, the concept of the dominant function becomes a bit less distinct. There's probably ways of maintaining, you know, its distinctness by saying, well, it's still the function that requires the least amount of libidinal power or energy to deploy and so on, but still its distinctness is weakened. And also, well, remain with the unconscious, you know, what functions can be said then to account for unconscious processes if all functions are conscious and integrated. the unconscious field suddenly finds itself deprived of explanatory concepts to account for what's going on unconsciously if we rid ourselves of the unconscious functions. So, that's something to take into account. In MBTI, that problem doesn't arise because SE in the case of INFJs, NE in the case of ISTJs, ISFJs, and FE in the case of INTPs and ISTPs. Those functions are never fully integrated. They're something that we have to cope with. So again, taking the example of the INFJ as our point of focus, the SE grip concept, it's actually a good way also of getting to a final decision as to whether your type is in fact INFJ. Because you may be asking yourself that question. I'm sure there are people in my audience every week that are asking themselves, but am I really an INFJ? How can I be absolutely certain? And there's lots of ways, if you're a TI user, how is your TI? How is your FE? And so on and so forth. What is your introversion like? But the SE grip is actually one good way of at least figuring out whether you're an INJ. It might not tell you whether you're a T or an F, but it will tell you whether you're an INJ. Because being in the SE grip is something that can be recognized by a lot of quite clearly describable symptoms. And then again, these symptoms are probably best understood within the framework of Jung's psychological types. The idea is more or less this. Yes, it is true that being in the grip is caused by experiencing stress. And not just momentary stress, not temporary stress, but stress for long periods. In a way, it's conditioned stress. You're in the condition of being stressed over maybe weeks and months. So in turn, this requires us to understand better what could lead to this condition. And it seems to me quite clear that we are led to being in this condition by being forced in an environment that is somehow not natural for us, and is in fact so unnatural for us that we constantly have to distort our identity, distort our personality, distort our natural, most effortless way of being in order to accommodate the demands of the situation. So there could be many such sources, but I think in our day and age, and very, very, the most clear, the most obvious example that comes to mind is just the demands of a job. So, you may very well find yourself in a workplace, in a position, a job position that is not just very suited, and you may think at first that you just need to get used to it, that you need to absorb the information, that with learning and more confidence, more experience leads to more confidence, and eventually you'll be good at your job and everything will be more natural. Now that can certainly happen, but it's also possible that it will not happen. And if it does not happen, well, there will be constantly a state of repressing who you are. That's where the Jungian account becomes relevant, and we can use it, because repressing who you are in Jungian terms can be more or less equated to repressing your dominant function and maybe your auxiliary function too. And that is, in fact, according to Jung, the ideal condition if that's repeated, replicated, and maintained over a long period of time when you're repressing your dominant and auxiliary functions in order to accommodate the demands of an external situation. That is what is going to let the dominant and auxiliary functions, deprive them of the libidinal energy that is typically channeled to them. That libidinal energy remains or sinks in the unconscious, is the word that Jung often uses, and is captured by the more inferior unconscious functions, which Jung says emerge in open opposition to the dominant functions and assume what looks like dominance. But they assume this dominance with all the traits that are still characteristic of what is an unintegrated unconscious function, namely the archaic traits, namely the infantile traits. So when the INFJ is in the grip or the INTJ is in the grip, they don't look really like ESTPs or ESFPs. What they would look like is ESTPs or ESFPs that are like overgrown infants or something like that, or completely out of bounds SE dominance. They react very easily to impulses. They tend to adopt a very, very worrying relationship to risk-taking and thrill-seeking. There's a difference between seeking thrills and taking risks from a point of view of knowing what your boundaries are. That's why SE dominants are often good entrepreneurs, because they have this approach to risk-taking that is, in some sense, it's natural to them and it's mature to them. Now, from the point of view of the SE of an INFJ or an INTJ, the SE is not mature, and therefore it's put in a situation where it seeks thrills and takes risks and acts on impulses in the way that someone who has absolutely no markers, someone who's just pushed in the situation without having had the experiential path to be able to manage these situations in ways that are safe. And I think that a great example of this from fiction, and I think that some of you viewers will have seen this show because it was very popular, it probably still is very popular, is The Queen's Gambit. You know, the mini-series on Netflix. Great show about Beth, I think is her name, the chess prodigy champion. Now, she seems in the show to be an INJ type, okay? Again, I most people will probably think INTJ for her, but I'm not interested in trying to figure this out really at this point, because what's interesting is that there are there's clear evidence in the show that she goes through a lot of phases of being in the SE grip, because she's forced in a context where there's a lot of public attention on her, there's lots of demands on her that conflicts with the natural channeling of her NI function. And so outside of when she's playing chess, I think there's a lot of repression of NI that goes on, and you can really see how that leads to this open opposition of the SE function that raises itself out of the unconscious and makes her pursue a very destructive lifestyle that ends up being a real issue when it comes to her rise to to chess stardom. I won't spoil what happens in the end, but that's a very, very good example, not only of what the SE grip is, but of how you can identify your type, at least INJ type, in case this is something that you relate to. If you do not relate to this in any way, and if your grip modes are very different, manifest in more, immature SI ways or immature NE ways or immature TI ways or whatever it might be, that could be strong evidence that you're not an INJ type. Okay, so these were my thoughts in somewhat holistic fashion. I'd be very curious to hear what you think, and if you agree with me that the concept of grip is very important in Jung and MBTI, and it partly is what makes them very distinct as systems. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys. Bye-bye.